So this video is going to be looking at Tacitus's account of Tiberius's accession to the emperorship, and what our key question for this is going to be: how reluctant or not was Tiberius in coming to the throne? So when we're looking at the sources on Tiberius, we do need to consider, like I said previously, the question about whether or not Tiberius wanted to rule. But we also need to sort of be aware that Tiberius is constantly living up to this image of Augustus that has been laid before him. So remember, Augustus was the first to do what he has done in in the late Republic stroke into the early emperorship. And this is a lot for Tiberius to live up to. And even in this source, Tiberius can't escape this. Obviously, the source is written a long time afterwards, but it'll become clear as you're reading through this particular section of Tacitus. Also keep in mind that Tacitus really dislikes Tiberius, and he really dislikes Augustus because of the tyrannical emperor that he had been living under himself. So everything we read is going to be probably quite negative, and even any praise is going to be kind of backhanded. So there's lots of things we need to keep in mind about for our question about Tiberius. In fact, for Tiberius, before I move on, remember one of the key bullet points we look at for the interpretation question is the portrayal of the emperor's character. So for Tiberius, this is definitely about whether or not he was a tyrant, was he reluctant to rule, or did he actually just want power for himself? It's really hard to tell with Tiberius because he was quite a closed book. The senators didn't particularly know him very well. Nobody knew him very well. He kept himself to himself, and he actually went into self-imposed exile for a while when he was sort of deeply unhappy about the way things were going in his life. It's a bit depressing, I think, when we look at Tiberius. But anyway, so we're going to look at the source by Tacitus about Tiberius's accession to the throne. So the first act of the New Principate was the murder of Agrippa Postumus. So New Principate, is referring to Tiberius's rule. And remember, Agrippa Postumus had been exiled by Augustus because he was seen as being too dangerous to possibly becoming an emperor, although he was his last grandson. And according to Tacitus, Tiberius has him killed off because, in theory, Agrippa could have replaced him slightly more legitimately, because obviously Tiberius was linked to the bloodline directly through Julia the Elder. But in reality, obviously, he was excluded by Augustus, and Tiberius was the one who's named in the heir. So the likelihood that he would have ever been really a threat to Tiberius is probably quite remote. Anyway, so although Agrippa had suspected nothing, was unarmed, he himself was resolute in his intention. The centurion who did the deed had the greatest difficulty in dispatching him. Typical of Agrippa Postumus, makes life difficult, or even in death. Tiberius said nothing to the Senate about the matter. He was pretending that his father had left orders which instructed the military tribune responsible for his custody to put Agrippa to death without delay. So he is pretending that it's in the will, essentially. What we do have, in fact we'll highlight it already, is maybe an element of Tiberius wanting power because he doesn't consult the Senate, or he's worried about how the Senate's going to react, so he sort of excludes them from the situation. It's a couple of interpretations for how he wants to do it, how you want to look at it, sorry. Augustus had certainly uttered many harsh criticism of the young man's character, that's certainly true, and had thus ensured that his exile was sanctioned by decree of the Senate, but he never steeled himself to have any of his relatives killed, nor was it credible he would have had his grandson put to death to ensure his stepson's peace of mind. Which I would suggest with Tacitus is probably true here. More likely, Tiberius and Livia, he through fear and she, with the stepmother's malice, had moved swiftly to eliminate a young man who they suspected and hated. So again, the likelihood that Livia had anything to do with this is highly suspect. Whether Tiberius did have this guy killed because he was frightened of what he represented is a possibility. With Tiberius, it's very hard to tell what he really was thinking or what he was really feeling. But anyway. So when the centurion reported out a military custom its order had been carried out, Tiberius replied that he had given no order and that a formal report must be laid before the Senate. So he's like, not my fault, I didn't tell him to do it. When this was discovered by Sallustius Crispus, brilliant name, who was party to the secret dealings, it was he who had sent the note to the tribune. He was afraid that he would be personally held accountable for the deed, and that he was equally at risk whether he lied or told the truth. So he warned Livia about the secrets of the household, the advice of friends, and the services of soldiers should not be made public, and that Tiberius should not undermine the power of the Principate by referring everything to the Senate. So, like I said, one of the things we've got to be aware of for Tiberius, one of our key questions is whether or not Tiberius is reluctant to rule. So here we've got some evidence that maybe he was quite reluctant because he's referring everything to the Senate, and people are advising him not to do so, that he should be sort of taking a firm hand. You could argue maybe Tiberius is actually more Republican than Augustus here, because obviously the Senate had more power under him, possibly, depending on the source. But what we do have here is maybe some evidence that Tiberius is somewhat reluctant to take over from Augustus's position, since it was of the very essence of ruling that accounts should only balance if they were rendered to a single individual. And then we got a little bit of a contradiction here. So you got Tiberius being reluctant to rule, but according to Tacitus, at Rome, there was this headlong rush to servitude. So he's suggesting that Tiberius takes over completely. But he's also suggesting that it's the Republic, in inverted commas, is choosing this. So consuls, senators are questions. The higher their status, the greater the haste, the greater hypocrisy. So they all kind of rush to sort of become servants or slaves, in inverted commas, to Tiberius of their own choice, as each composed his expression as so to appear neither delighted at the death of the princeps, i.e. Augustus, nor distressed at the accession of another, Tiberius, carefully blending tears with joy, flattery, and lamentation. Lamentation? Yeah. Sextus Pompeius and Sextus Apuleius, the consuls, were the first to take the oath of allegiance to Tiberius Caesar. If you're reading the name Sextus Pompeius and going, but I thought he died when the second triumvirate around, yeah, not the same person, this guy with exactly the same name. So either way, the consuls swear the oath of allegiance to Tiberius straight away, so Tiberius has power. And there were some people present, so there were some prefects, some praetorian cohorts. Soon the Senate, soldiery, and people followed suit. So everybody decides to side with Tiberius, swears his oath of allegiance, therefore Tiberius is in control. For Tiberius initiated all business through the consuls, as though the old republic still existed, and he himself had doubts about ruling. So then we go evidence that maybe he's reluctant to rule. Even the edict by which the senators were called to the Senate House was issued by virtue of the tribucan power, which he'd received under Augustus. So again, he is appearing to be reluctant to be princeps or essentially the sole ruler. The edict itself was brief and in its tone very modest, to the effect that he would consult about the honours due to his father, Augustus, that he was remaining with the corpse, and this was the only public duty which he was discharging. So he's only going to basically look after Augustus's body, and they should figure out what they're going to do themselves. But in fact, on the death of Augustus, he had given the password of the day to the praetorian cohorts as commander. The armed guards and other appurentenses of the court were his. His soldiers escorted him to the forum and to the Senate House. So actually, it would appear here that he's taking charge of the Republic. He's just doing it behind the scenes. He's not doing it in a really overt way. I really should stop calling it the Republic of the Empire. He sent dispatches to the army as though the Principate had already been conferred upon him. So this isn't reluctance to rule. This is the complete opposite. He is, as Tacitus says, acting decisively in every sphere. So he is taking over the Principate. He's not reluctant to rule. You can see here that we've got contradictions in the same source about Tiberius, because nobody really knows what Tiberius wants. What we do know is that he does not want to address the Senate for whatever reason. All this stemmed primarily from his fear that Germanicus, with so many legions and a swarm of allied auxiliaries at its disposal and remarkable popular support, might prefer the reality of power to his expectations. So he's concerned about a member of his family, Germanicus. There are sources that will contradict that later, that actually he was using Germanicus in order to solidify his own popularity. So again, sources are going to contradict themselves a lot about this. He had an eye to public opinion also, since he wished to appear to have been summoned and elected by the Republic, which, to be honest, is what Augustus had done. So he's maybe copying what Augustus did here, rather than to infiltrate his power through a wife scheming and a senile old man's adoption. That's obviously Livia. Maybe he's trying to make sure it looks like he's earned the power. Obviously, remember Augustus had always promoted his family members, and made sure they'd taken on roles that would have promoted themselves automatically by giving them power and sort of prestige. So is he doing anything different from what Augustus would have done? Probably not. I think it seems a little unfair to blame it on Livia and Augustus being an old guy and adopting him. Later it became clear that he had affected his hesitant manner as a way of testing the inclinations of the leading men. So according to Tacitus, it appears that Tiberius is putting this whole reluctance to rule act on, and he's just doing it to test the Senate. For he distorted men's words and expressions into proofs of treachery, and he never forgot them. So he sort of tested the Senate, and if they sort of are reluctant to maybe praise Tiberius, he sort of uses that against them a bit later on. I would suggest that Tacitus is making this point because there were some very unpleasant actions taken by Tiberius later on in his rule, but I don't want to spoil it, so I will not mention what those things were, but it's not very good. At the Senate's first meeting, he allowed no business to be transacted except matters pertaining to the funeral of Augustus. So, again, maybe reluctance. He's focusing just on the funeral, not about taking power. This bit here just goes through the will again, so it just repeats what Suetonius had said, so I'm not going to go over it, because it is quite literally, practically word for word, the same thing. We have the Senate consulted about Augustus's honours, so we have power of the Senate here. Again, is Tiberius reluctant to rule because he's handing over the power to him. This bit here is going through what honours they might have voted for him, but the ones they didn't vote for in the end. It's about the one about him being where are we? Going through the triumphal gate. So that was also mentioned in Suetonius. We have another member of the Senate. So we've got Marcella proposed that the oath of allegiance to the Emperor should be renewed annually. So you've maybe got evidence that the Senate's kind of jumping over themselves to support Tiberius, to give Tiberius power and I can't remember the right word, but you get the point I'm making. When Tiberius asked him if he suggested in response to any prompting from himself, he replied that it was on his own initiative, and that all matters pertaining to the safety of the state, he would be influenced only by his personal judgment, even at the risk of giving offence. Okay. This represented the only form of flattery that remained available. The Senate declared with one voice that the court should be carried on the shoulders of the senators to funeral pyre. Caesar excused them with haughty moderation. So we've got evidence here of Tiberius's kind of he's not a very people person kind of guy, and this could be evidence of it. So he's a little bit haughty. He's not necessarily winning over the Senate by warm words and warm behaviours. He's quite a closed off kind of guy, which is obviously going to be a bit of an issue when you're trying to maybe create some support for yourself. And then it talks about through the rest of the funeral. And then we got the funeral is occurring, and that the soldiers sort of stand guard. Everyone thinks it's a bit silly, but again, not particularly relevant to what we need to be aware of. And then poor old Tiberius, as I said earlier, he's always compared to Augustus, and this is, Tacitus is going to do the same thing. He's now going to spend a really long section about Augustus, which is why I have chosen a different colour. So these source quotes can be used in anything to do with Augustus, in terms of like the power he had and links to other topics as well. Okay, so after this there was much discussion about Augustus. Most people wondered at such trifles as the coincidence that the day in which he assumed the imperium was the same on which he had died, that he had departed this life at Nola in the same house as father and bedroom as the father of Octavius. They remarked also on the number of his consulships, so that we could show that he didn't restore the Republic because he was consul so many times. The fact that he had held the tribune power for 37 years, that he had Imperator gained 21 times, and lots of other honours, multiple or novel. Among those of a more thoughtful turn of mind, however, his life was either extolled or criticised. One school of thought argued that his duty to his father and the needs of the Republic, in which there was then no place or law, had driven him to civil war. So there's a backhanded sort of like, oh no, it's not even backhanded. So obviously Tacitus is going to go through what the two different sides of thought about Augustus were, those who supported him and those who did not. So his supporters saying, yes, he took over the Republic, but it's because there was no kind of like safety, there was no law, and he'd been forced to have a civil war as a result of it. And then they continue to justify his behaviour. So while seeking vengeance on his father's murderers, he had indeed made any concessions to Antony and many to Lepidus. That's selective. Once the latter had lapsed into the interior, or whatever, or senility, and the former become corrupted by his own vices, there remained no other solution to this cause of the fatherland than it should be ruled by one man. Probably not wrong, to be honest. You've studied the late Republic. You know how chaotic it was. Did it need one person in control? Yeah, probably. He had ordered the Republic not as a kingdom nor as a dictatorship, but under the name of princeps, which, remember, that just means first citizen. So he's equal to everybody, but slightly more. So he's saying, it's not a king, it's not a dictatorship, it's just princeps. Boundaries of the empire were now defended by the oceans. He extended the empire, so it's quite good for Augustus's military leadership. By mighty rivers, legions, provinces, fleets, and their general administration were all now coordinated. So we can also talk about the benefits of imperial rule. So obviously a benefit of Augustus's rule was that he had extended the empire, that he ruled it not as a dictator, and that administration in general terms was also working really well. So hang on, let me just change my colour. There we go. We have the laws observed. He got being kind to their allies. The city itself is magnificently adorned, so he built lots of really pretty things. Only a few occasions had force been used, and guaranteed peace and quiet for the rest. So things were brilliant under Augustus, according to his supporters. So again, you can use his quotes all over the place about Augustus. And then he says others argue to the contrary. If you look at the amount of time into defense of Augustus, is literally just like this tiny little bit here. And the fact that Tacitus spends all this time on the bad things, you can kind of see what Tacitus really thinks. So duty to his father in the crisis of the Republic were simply convenient pretexts. I mean, that might possibly be true, to be fair to Tacitus. His lust for despotic power led him to incite the veterans by bribery. Yeah, he pretty much had used bribery, so maybe true. Whether he was a lust for despotic power is very hard to tell for Augustus. To raise an army when a young man and a private citizen, to corrupt the consular legions, to feign support for the Pompeian faction. Soon having by senatorial decree seized the fasces and status of a praetor, which is true, so remember he sent his centurion to gain the power. He took possession of both their armies after the deaths of Hirtius and Pansa, whether these were due to enemy action, or Pansa's to the application of poison to his wounds, and Hirtius to his own mutinous soldiery and seized his munitions. He then extorted the consulship from reluctant Senate, that is true, it's mentioned in Appian, and turned against the Republic the very forces from which he received for the campaign against Antony, again true. The prescriptions of citizens and land confiscations had followed, also true, but also not just Octavian's idea, they were also Lepidus and Antony's enemies, of which not even the perpetrators approved. I'm not sure that's entirely true. Might it be granted that the deaths of Brutus and Cassius were a debt he owed to inherited enmity, though it is right for private feuds to be waived in the public interest? But Pompeius had been duped by Spurious peace. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I would disagree with Tacitus on that. I think under the Second Triumvirate they were generally, I think, this is my interpretation, trying to keep Pompeius on side, but Pompeius had broken the treaty, so it's not entirely their fault. And Lepidus by the pretense of friendship, that's most likely true. And later Antony, seduced by the treaties of Tarentum and Brundisium and by marriage to Octavian's sister, had paid with his life for a Spurious kingship. I mean, the marriages obviously was to solidify the Second Triumvirate, but also remember it was Antony who had discarded Octavian's sister. So again, I would suggest Tacitus is being somewhat selective about the way he's portraying Augustus here. That peace that followed could not be denied, but it was peace stained with blood. So he's sort of saying, yes, there was peace created, under the Augustus' principate, but actually, did not come without a price. So you've got military disasters of Lollius and Varus, at Rome the killings of Varro, Ignatius, and Ilusus. Nor was Augustus' household spared. There was the abduction of Nero's wife, and that ludicrous consultation with the priest as to whether she could legally marry while pregnant. That's Livia. That's who he is referring to, and she wasn't abducted, but not yet delivered of a child. The extravagant lifestyle of Pollio, never heard of him. And finally, there was Livia, an oppressive mother to the state, an oppressive stepmother to the house of Caesar. So all Caesar's fault. It was all Livia's fault. Not true. There were no honours left for the gods now that Augustus chose he worshipped with temples and gods-like images. So that's really good for the imperial cult. And because you remember, Augustus was trying to portray himself as, yes, he's descended from the gods, but he's not a god. And Tacitus here is saying, no, he just wanted to be worshipped like a god. It's really obvious. So that's quite a nice evidence for that. So images and by priests. He had not even appointed Tiberius a successor from affection or concern for the Republic because when he looked at his arrogance and cruelty, he hoped that the odious comparison would rebound to his own greater glory. That's not true. I mean, remember, Augustus has spent all that time adopting every living male in his family and all got killed off one by one through various different problems. Tiberius is very much the last on the list. Suetonius' idea that Tiberius had been adopted as a last resort is way more accurate, and that's because he ran out of Julian bloodline, excluding a group of Postumus who he chose not to adopt. So the fact that Tacitus is suggesting he did it just to make himself look better is not true. Because we've studied Augustus, you know what his behaviour was towards the rest of his family. He wanted the Julians, he ran out of Julians, so he went for the Claudians. So Tacitus is talking a whole load of codswallop. Only a few years before, when Augustus had been requesting from the Senate a renewal of the tribunal power for Tiberius, in the midst of a complimentary speech he had included as to excuse them certain criticisms of his deportment, style of dress and way of life. Okay, so he's using that as evidence that Augustus hated him. I'm not sure that's true. He did bring him up. However, now we're back to Tiberius. Once the funeral rites were duly completed, a temple and divine cult were decreed. So that is about Augustus, so he is deified. It was Tiberius who was now the focus of men's prayers. He dilated upon the massive burden of empire in his own modest capacities. So again, reluctance to rule. He is sort of like, oh my god, this empire's huge, and I'm not capable, I'm not going to be good enough. Only the genius of an Augustus, now deified, was equal to such a mighty task. He himself, having been summoned by Augustus to share his labours, had learned by experience how arduous a task it would be to rule of the world, how subject to the vagaries of fortune. For that reason, in a state which could depend on the talents of so many distinguished men, all the burden should not fall upon the shoulders of one. So essentially, Tiberius, because he's aware of how difficult it is to rule an empire as princeps, was using the Senate, which is distinguished men, and the equestrians to rule for him alongside him. So again, is that a reluctance to rule or being sensible? Depends how you look at it. The task of government could be more readily discharged through the cooperative efforts of a greater number. I mean, that's probably quite sensible, to be fair. One man in control of everything never really works. This speech lacked the conviction appropriate to such worthy sentiments. So Tacitus is saying, yeah, this is what Tiberius said, but in reality, it's obvious he didn't really mean it. So like I said, Tacitus does not like Tiberius. He's trying to prove that he was always going to be a tyrant and bloodthirsty. Tiberius' words, whether by nature or habit, were always hesitantly and ambiguously expressed, even when he was not trying to mask his intentions. On this occasion, however, when he was doing his utmost to conceal his most secret ambitions, so again, evidence to show that he wanted to take power, they became all the more convoluted, ambiguous, and capable of several interpretations. For the senators, by contrast, there was only one anxiety, to avoid being seen to understand him all too well. They were in the midst of a flood of protestations, lamentations, supplications, stretching out their aims to the gods. I'm pretty certain I should say arms to the gods. The statue of Augustus and the knees of Tiberius himself when he gave orders for a document to be produced and read aloud. So the Senate wants him to take control, saying, but are they doing that just to make themselves look good? Tiberius is pretending he doesn't want to take control, but he secretly does. Like I said, the sources contradict each other about this particular attitude of Tiberius. So then it's this document. So it contains a list of all public resources, number of citizens, auxiliary and allied auxiliaries in the army, the fleets, the client kingdoms and provinces, together with the tributes and taxes they paid, and the essential expenditure and optional grants they received. Augustus had recorded this all in his own hand, and in the recommendation, whether through motives of jealousy or genuine anxiety, the empire should not be extended beyond its current boundaries. So that ties in with Augustus's general military policy anyway, which is don't overextend, because it's really difficult to maintain the empire. With the Senate now reduced to its most grovelling entreaties, so the Senate is, acting like they're desperate for Tiberius to take control. Tiberius happened to remark, although he did not feel equal to the task of ruling the whole republic, he would accept the guardianship of whichever part was entrusted to him. So Tiberius sort of says, I'm not up for this, but I will do it if you ask me to. At this point, Asinius Gallus interjected, "What I want to know, Caesar, is this. Which part of the republic would you like to have entrusted to you?" Bit harsh, but probably a fair question. Disconcerted by the unexpected question, Tiberius was silent for a moment, but he recovered his poise and replied that given his feelings of inadequacy, it would be entirely inappropriate to make or avoid any particular choice, since his preference was for total exemption. So again, it is the idea that he does not really want to rule. This is wrong colour. Hang on, sorry. No, it's still the wrong colour. There we go. Evidence of reluctance to rule. He doesn't want to be emperor, honest. Gallus guessed from Tiberius' expression he given offence, so he now explained that his intention in putting the question had not been to recommend dividing of what was indivisible, but to demonstrate from Tiberius' own acknowledgement that a republic constituted a single body must be governed by the will of a single ruler. He also praised Augustus and reminded Tiberius of his own victories and many outstanding achievements over his long years in public life. That is Tiberius, saying, Augustus was amazing, but Tiberius, you're really good too. Tiberius had been a brilliant military commander under Augustus. This is what he's reminding him of. This did nothing to mollify the emperor. He long hated Gallus for marrying his own former wife Hispania, Marcus Agrippa's daughter, and thereby revealing a degree of ambition inappropriate to an ordinary citizen, and for inheriting a censorious worthy of his father Asinius Pollio. So he doesn't like members of the Senate, is the gist of that. Lucius Arantaeus then spoke in very familiar terms and gave no less offence, although Tiberius lacked any long-standing animosity towards him. But he was a rich man with a high public profile whose public reputation matched his remarkable talent and was therefore suspect. So again, we've got evidence that Tiberius doesn't trust the Senate, or senators anyway. So whether you want to highlight that, it's up to you. Indeed, during one of their last conversations, Augustus, in discussing the Principate, had distinguished between those who had the capacity to fill the office but would refuse it, those who desired it but lacked the capacity, and those who had both the capacity and the desire. He had suggested that Marcus Lepidus had the ability but would reject the Principate with contempt. Gallius Asinius coveted it but was inadequate to the task, while Luvius Arantaeus had both the ability and the nerve to make a bid for it if the chance were offered. Of the three names mentioned, our sources agreed upon the first two, but an alternative tradition reads Gnaeus Pius for Arantaeus. Lepidus apart, all of them were soon disposed of at Tiberius' instigation under varying criminal charges. So he appears to have three people who could have maybe undermined his taking control of the Principate, and they're all investigated for criminal charges and then gotten rid of. So read between the lines what you will. Quintus Tatius and Mammicus Scaurus also inflamed his inherently suspicious temperament. So there's a really good quote about the character of the emperors. Hatarius, by asking how long he proposed to allow the state to be without its head. So we could say a little bit of evidence about reluctance to rule by Tiberius. I can't say his name. By saying that there were grounds for optimism that the Senate's prayers would soon be answered in the fact that he had not used his tribunal powers to veto the consul's proposals. Tiberius promptly launched a tirade against him, but the remarks of this guy, against whom his anger was more implacable, he passed over in silence. So again, Tiberius seems to have quite a difficult relationship with members of the Senate. In the end, exhausted by the general clamour and the individual protestations, he began to give way little by little to the point of ceasing to provoke continued demands for his persistent refusal, without actually acknowledging he had not accepted that the Principate. Again, we've got evidence of reluctance to rule. The sources record that Hatarius later went. Went into the palace to offer apologies, and as Tiberius walked past, he clasped his knees in supplication, an act which brought Tiberius crashing to the ground, either by mishap or because he tripped him. It's a bit embarrassing. This nearly led to his own death at the hands of the bodyguards. Yeah, I bet it did. Despite his efforts, the threat to this distinguished senator's life remained undiminished until he appealed to Livia and gained protection through her zealous intervention. So now we're going to have a little bit about Livia as well. So she too became the object of widespread flattery by the Senate. One thing we have to keep in mind is always the importance of family, friends and freedmen and wives, as well as mothers, in the emperorship. So we've got some evidence here that the Senate are trying to keep, obviously, Tiberius's mother, Livia, on side. Some propose that she should be given the title of parental mother of a country. Very many that the title son or duly be added to Caesar's formal designation. Tiberius, however, repeatedly insisted that honours for women should be strictly curtailed, and that he personally would display the same moderation over honours offered to himself. So again, about this sort of display of moderation about honours to himself, maybe it's a reluctance to rule here. He doesn't want all the titles that maybe Augustus got. So he doesn't feel like he deserved them. I get that. Nevertheless, jealous made him anxious. I think jealousy made him anxious, and because he regarded elevation in status of for a woman as a diminution of his own, he refused to allow her to be even voted a single lictor, basic bodyguards, and also vetoed an altar of adoption and other such honours. But for Germanicus Caesar, he requested proconsular imperium. So Germanicus Caesar is Tiberius's nephew. And Tiberius used him a lot to gain some. He was very popular, Germanicus, and Tiberius used him to kind of leech off some of his popularity as well. And what was I going to suggest? And he used him for some military campaigns as well. So he is promoting his nephew. So he requested a proconsular imperium, and a special delegation was dispatched to confer it upon him, and at the same time to offer condolences on the death of Augustus. The reason he did not seek similar distinctions for Drusus was he was consul designate already present in Rome, so he just needed to promote the other member of his family. For the praetorship, he nominated 12 candidates, which was a traditional number established by Augustus, and when the Senate urged him to increase the number, he bound himself by strict oath not to do so. So there is evidence here that Tiberius is not reluctant to rule because he's taking charge of the situation. He's not just sort of sitting around, wringing his hands going, oh, what am I going to do? I don't want to be emperor. He's, giving imperium, he's naming praetors, he's doing everything he needs to do as well. That was the first time, too, that elections were transferred from the citizens' assemblies to the Senate, so we got an administration change. Hitherto, though, the most important were settled by decision of the princeps, some were still left to the wishes of the assembly of the tribes. So again, this is about administration. The people raised no objection to the loss of this prerogative, perhaps in casual conversation, while the Senate gladly acquiesced, since it was consequently spared the need for expensive and undignified solicitation of votes. As Tiberius guaranteed he would not recommend more than 4 candidates, he would have to be appointed without rejection or canvass. So these are administrative changes for elections, which I will highlight as a whole, because there is a sort of key theme we have to look at. There we go. In terms of administration changes made by the emperor. So there's some quite sensible ones about elections. At the same time, the tribunes sought permission to celebrate their own expense games, which would be added to the official calendar to be known as the Augustales, derived from the name Augustus, no kidding. It was decided that they should be financed by the state treasury, and that the tribunes should be allowed to wear triumphal dress in the Circus Maximus, but not to ride in a triumphal chariot. The conduct of his annual celebration was soon transferred to the praetor, who felt responsibility for civil suits between between citizens and foreigners. Whew. So the general gist of that Tacitus source then is Tiberius appears to be reluctant to rule, but he might not be reluctant to rule, depending which part of the source you look at. Augustus may have acted in the right way because he's trying to save the state, but also he may not have acted in that way because he wanted to be a ruler. Tacitus clearly always thinks the latter, which is Tiberius clearly wanted to be in power but was pretending not to be, and Augustus was a tyrant who pretended not to be. But when it comes to our key questions for our sources, it is very useful because it obviously can be used to contradict and shows the clear prejudices that Tacitus has against the different emperors that we study.